And to our first conversation now, we'll be talking about brain export. Might sound kind of bizarre, but the focus is actually human capital. In a report by PwC titled Nigerian Brain Exports, the Optimal Path to Growing the Nigerian Economy, recently released by PwC there. We're going to break this report down now with Andrew Nevin, partner and chief economist, PwC Nigeria, joining us right there via Zoom. Great to have you on the show.
To be here. It's always a pleasure to be with Channels and you, Laddie. Thank you.
Always a pleasure to have you now. So when I hear brain exports, brain drain, kind of comes to mind. And I'd like to know, what are your key findings, from your report?
Yeah, so let's just start out with the basic reality here. We need to import things in Nigeria. We can't produce cell phones. We can't produce automobiles. We can't produce machinery. We can't produce computers. Those are all things that we need the next medium term that are not to be produced locally. So we need FX. So what is a viable source of FX for Nigeria? Traditionally, of course, we've relied on oil. There's been essentially a collapse on that. The production of oil, the time I've been here, has dropped from about 2 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day. And given our oil subsidy, it's no longer really a source of FX. So then you ask the question, can we export physical goods? And we make the argument that, in fact, and you just made the argument as well for us, this country is not competitive in exporting physical goods. So when we try, because of the electricity issues, because of the infrastructure challenges, because of the ports. I mean, you might have seen in the press recently, there's over ₦1 trillion worth of goods rotting in the ports of Apapa because it's not being cleared off of that. It just shows you the difficulty with that. So we are not competitive at exporting physical goods. But there's a very positive side to the story, because actually 70% of the world's GDP is in services. And what we can export are high value added services with people remaining in Nigeria. This is already happening even by individuals, but also at scale in Nigeria. And that's the only strategy that's going to be viable for our exports. So that's what the paper discusses. And we put the target, we'd like to have 2 million Nigerians in Nigeria working in global value chains, but producing FX in their communities, buying houses, supporting their families, sending people to education in Nigeria. So this is complete opposite of the brain drain. This is taking advantage of Nigeria's incredible brain power, the brain power of the youth, but with people remaining in Nigeria. So that's the core of the strategy.
So how do you export these brains without the people actually leaving the country?
Well, I mean, this is something that started in the 1990s, and India was really the first country to do this with business process outsourcing. Today, India has a surplus of $100 billion a year in services. But what's happened with COVID is that, of course, we found out there's many more ways to deliver services remotely than we thought. So more and more jobs can be done remotely. And we now have examples in this country where we have companies delivering accounting services, delivering legal services. I learned yesterday in one of my discussions, delivering architecture services while people remain in Nigeria. So this was always there, and we had started in the mid-2010s. But with the COVID, it's really accelerated and make it more acceptable. So what we need to do as a country to solve our FX, our balance of payments problems, growth for prosperity, is embrace this trend on that across all the spheres. And of course, we already export services like Nollywood and music, very high value added financial services, but it needs to be expanded across the sphere, and particularly around things to do with the digital economy. So this is coding for employment, business process outsourcing, animation, where there's a huge number of global jobs that Nigerians can fill.
Right, and talking about this issue of brain drain, in the country, we have a huge population, and we've relied on oil, for the longest time. And I saw something interesting in your report there. It says Nigerians in diaspora actually bring in more money than oil. And I'm wondering, how does that, can you break it down for us?
Well, I think people sometimes get confused with the gross numbers. So, I mean, a typical year, Nigeria is often exported about 50 to 60 billion US dollars worth of oil. And of course, the official number from, I think, the World Bank database for the diaspora remittances is about $25 billion US. It dropped a bit during the COVID era. Of course, that underestimates it because of the informal flows. But what people forget about is when we sell 50 to 60 billion US dollars worth of oil to the world, that doesn't mean 50 to 60 billion US dollars worth of money comes to the country. A lot of the expenses are in US dollars. It never enters it. I can tell you the expats that work on these projects, they're getting paid offshore. That money, very little of it enters Nigeria. If they have debt or they're making interest or dividend payments out of the oil proceeds of the company, that's not coming to Nigeria. That's just being paid offshore. So that 50 or 60 billion US dollars doesn't enter. The difference with the diaspora remittances is the diaspora's already paid for all the expenses. This is a net earning to the country. They've already paid their rent or their home ownership in their country. They've already paid for the food in the country. They've paid for the education. They've paid for healthcare. What they're sending is what's left over, and it's the net amount that comes into the country. So, in fact, in terms of the impact on the Nigerian economy, the diaspora remittances are already bigger than the oil.
Quite interesting. And tell us about the high-end global value chains, because it also says you recommend placing Nigerians in high-end GVCs. How does that actually work?
Well, let me give you a couple of examples of Nigerians in sort of the high-value global value chains. So I think the most valuable, people may argue because it was actually born in Greece, but I still think of it as Nigerian. Giannis Antetokounmpo, of course, is the superstar basketball player of the Milwaukee Bucks. I mean, he's worth at least $500 million to $1 billion as an individual, exported from Nigeria, essentially. I was watching the game last night, Nottingham Forest versus Leicester. Very painful for me. I wanted Taiwo Awoniyi to score. But we know the footballers, when they play in the Nigerian Professional League, may earn $30,000 at the most. A few of them, when they're in the Premier League, when they're Bundesliga, I mean, they have 50 million, 60 million euro transfer fees associated with them. So that's an example of Nigerians being inserted into high-value global value chains. But for millions of Nigerians, they can be coders for employment. So it's rather than working for a Nigerian company or struggling to get a job here, there's a shortage of workers around the world because of demographics. They need educated young people to fill these jobs. There's 28 million software developers in the world. The number is going to 45 million software developers. There's no reason that we shouldn't have close to 2 million of those software developers in the next 10 or 15, well, 5 or 10 or 15 years. And it's happening already on that. If you contrast this with, if we always talk about manufacturing, but in the low-end manufacturing ladder that South Korea followed or China followed, but the problem with that is, I mean, it's not like the wages in low-end manufacturing are that high. And why would we ask Nigerians to work at low wages in low-end manufacturing, and with all the difficulties we know with power and with infrastructure, and with the ports and with the government, when they can insert themselves now into high value-added value chains? I mean, if you think about Apple Corporation, the people assembling the iPhones in the Foxconn factories in southern China don't earn very much. The people developing the software to support the iPhones, whether they're in Silicon Valley or in Nigeria now, are earning a lot more. So why would we go into low-end manufacturing? Let's just skip that, leapfrog it like we've done with the mobile telephony, for example, like we're doing with our banking system. Let's leapfrog to the highest value-added services that we can deliver globally around the world. And that will lead to a much more prosperous and a cleaner Nigeria.
All right, tell us about other case studies. You know, you did mention India. You know, tell us about other, case studies of countries that actually, rely on and getting, the benefits of brain exports.
Well, India is the best example. As I said, they run 100 billion surplus, $100 billion US surplus in services. They run a deficit in manufacturing. They've clearly decided that from a economic strategy viewpoint, that exporting high value-added services is the optimal strategy, and it's working very well for them. Another country that may surprise you that's starting to do more of this is actually Kenya. And when we looked into it and we cited in the paper, on a proportional basis, they already have more workers in global value chains working remotely from Kenya on a proportional basis than Nigeria does. So they're down the track. Philippines has done a very good job. Of course, they've traditionally had this model of exporting workers in the diaspora, but particularly for low-end jobs, which is not always satisfactory. They're now rotating more to the business process outsourcing, the coding for employment in the Philippines. So those are three countries that have decided that this is really the way to go. But I mean, at a very basic level, what's the most valuable complex asset on the planet? It's the human brain. What's the most valuable asset for Nigeria? It's Nigerian brains. So we should be selling Nigerian brains rather than selling oil or rather than selling low-end manufactured goods.
And, talking about, selling Nigerian brains, now we know education is a major, factor that helps to actually improve the amount of brains you're actually exporting. And looking at the situation here in Nigeria, we're seeing what's happening with ASU, and the federal government. So it looks like that is going to impact how much we can actually export going, in the future.
No, absolutely. I mean, this ASU strike is a complete disaster for the country. I mean, we've taken our most valuable asset and we're reducing it very rapidly by young people not being in university, not getting the skills they need. But the good news is I think there are a lot of other alternative providers that are coming to the marketplace to provide education that's more relevant, that better leads to employment than necessarily the Nigerian State University or federal government university system. I'll give one example. Nexford University, fantastic online university run by a brilliant Nigerian. They just did their second graduating class, I think, and their graduates, they pay a lot less than even going to Nigerian university, or about the same amount when you take all the fees. And they're coming out with more marketable skills. But also, if you think of coding for employment or even business process outsourcing, you don't necessarily have to have a university degree. So what you're seeing emerging now are programs that can take a WIAC holder, and in a year or two, they are then skilled up in a way, not with a university degree, but to be able to enter these global value chains. Edo State, His Excellency Governor Obaseki, is executing this strategy. They've already got their first cohort of coders who are employed. I believe they're aiming for 35,000 people coding for employment. Of course, that comes roughly in par with our number. If all 36 states do 35,000 people, then we're talking over 1 million people in coding for employment. But that's another key aspect of this whole strategy is it's not dependent on one state or a highly centralized system. It's millions of individual Nigerians finding roles in these global value chains, companies in Nigeria, multiple companies building up these global value chains where people play the role in exporting their Nigerian brains into it. And that makes it a much more robust strategy than relying on large manufacturing infrastructure. And to be honest, people that have invested in hard assets in this country, all the 14 years I've been here, have really suffered on that. You looked at your segment on the electricity industry. Why would anyone invest in the electricity industry? Why would anyone invest in manufacturing right now? That you are going to lose your money. But if you invest in exporting services, I think it's going to be viable.
Right, and what would you say, the government now, talking about spending, where should they concentrate, that spending? Talking about, okay, the next government coming in, where should they concentrate spending, when they get in?
Well, I mean, we've said for years, and I'll repeat it again using the brain capital term, let's invest in the brain capital of Nigerian young people. So it means health and education, and particularly preparing them for insertion to these global value chains from an economic viewpoint. That's where we should be spending our money. I mean, we've been very negative on the foil subsidy. The number just grows and grows and grows. And, we do think it's kind of in its last death throes, the foil subsidy. It has to go. Why would you invest in subsidizing consumption? I read a very good article for our PwC Journalist Awards, which we're doing this week, that talks about the scale of the foil smuggling into countries, neighboring countries. Why are we investing the scarce resources of the nation to support this smuggling activity that benefits other nations, and yet we have the ASU on strike and no education and no ability to build that brain capital to earn prosperity for Nigeria? It doesn't make any sense. So our advice again is let's invest in Nigerian young people. If you invest in Nigerian young people's brain capital, we're pretty sure everything else will take care of itself in this country.
Everything else will take care of itself. Thank you so much, Mr. Andrew Nevin, partner, chief economist, PwC Nigeria. We need to get more brains exported going forward, I guess. Thank you so much. All right, so that was Andrew Nevin there, partner and chief economist at PwC Nigeria. So we're going to be taking a break now. When we come back, we head to the commodities space. That's the moment. Just stay with us.